mountain air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of ancient stone and forgotten things. Alara adjusted her headlamp as she descended deeper into the temple ruins, her breath forming clouds in the darkness. 3 years of research had led her here, to this forbidden site that modern packs pretended didn't exist. As an Omega historian, she'd been laughed out of every academic circle when she proposed that the Alpha Kings weren't myth, but history, that somewhere in these mountains lay proof of a time when their kind didn't hide from humans, didn't fracture into territorial gangs led by petty alphas drunk on small power. Her fingers traced symbols carved into walls that predated any written wolf language she knew, feeling the grooves worn smooth by centuries. The academic council had revoked her credentials, called her obsessed, dangerous even. They said Omegas shouldn't waste time on fantasies of powerful alphas who could command nature itself, that such stories only reinforced harmful hierarchies. But Alara knew the difference between fantasy and suppressed truth, and everything in these ruins screamed that something vital had been deliberately erased from their collective memory. The chamber opened suddenly before her, vast and circular, its domed ceiling disappearing into shadow despite her light. At the center stood a dais of black stone, and upon it, a figure. Alara's heart seized. The preservation was impossible, perfect, as though he'd been placed there. Yesterday, instead of however many centuries ago, this temple had been sealed. He was tall, powerfully built, dressed in armor that was clearly ceremonial but had seen real battle, etched with the same ancient symbols covering the walls. His face was angular, almost harsh, but there was something magnetic about it even in stillness. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and around his neck hung a pendant that made her academic mind scream with excitement. The royal seal she'd only seen in fragments, never whole, but it was the chains that made her blood run cold. Silver chains, hundreds of them, wrapped around his body in intricate patterns that were clearly ritual, not restraint. They glowed faintly with a sickly green light, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. If you're enjoying this journey into forgotten history, please hit that like button, and let me know in the comments what you think happened to the Alpha Kings. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to life. Alara approached, slowly, every instinct screaming danger. But her curiosity had always been stronger than her sense of self-preservation. The chains hummed as she drew near, a sound that resonated in her bones, in the Omega part of her that recognized alpha power even in suspension. She pulled out her camera, documenting everything, her hands shaking with adrenaline. This was it, the proof she needed. This was an Alpha King, or at least someone important enough to be imprisoned rather than killed, sealed away, with magic she didn't understand. The pendant drew her attention again, and before she could stop herself, she reached out to touch it. The metal was warm, impossibly warm, and the moment her fingers made contact, the green light in the chains flared brilliant white. Alara jerked back, but it was too late. The chains shattered, exploding into dust that glittered as it fell, and the man's eyes snapped open. They were gold, pure molten gold, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. Power rolled off him in waves, crushing, absolute, nothing like the alphas she'd known. This was different, ancient, primal, the kind of power that made the very air submit. He sat up slowly, chains falling away like water, and Alara stumbled backward, her wolf cowering inside her, even as her human mind tried to rationalize what was happening. He spoke, and the language was old, so old she barely recognized it as a proto-form of their modern tongue. But somehow she understood the meaning. How long? His voice was rough from disuse, but carried an authority that made her want to answer, to obey, to please. And she hated that instinct even as she fought it. I don't know, she managed, her own voice embarrassingly small. The temple has been sealed for at least 300 years. Maybe longer. The records are incomplete. His expression shifted, pain flickering across those harsh features, before hardening into something unreadable. He stood, and despite her fear, Alara couldn't help but notice how he moved, like violence contained in flesh, like a storm given form. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, and when he stepped off the dais, the stone beneath his feet cracked slightly, as though the earth itself acknowledged his weight, his significance. 300 years, he repeated. And this time she heard fluency in the modern language, as though he was pulling it from her mind or the air itself. They kept me under for 300 years. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the moment recognition hit. His nostrils flared, his pupils dilated, and that terrible power focused on her like a spotlight. "Omega," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, and hunger, and something else she couldn't name. "You freed me. Why?" Alara forced herself to stand straighter, to meet those gold eyes even though everything in her wanted to submit, to bare her throat, to acknowledge him as her alpha. "I'm a historian," she said, pleased. Her voice didn't shake. "I was researching the Old Kingdom. I didn't know anyone was actually here. I thought this was just another ruin." He moved closer, and she held her ground, even though her heart was hammering. "Just another ruin," he repeated softly, and there was such bitter amusement in his tone. "Is that what they call it now? What they've reduced us to?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, but she was frozen as his fingers brushed her cheek, calloused and warm. Touch sent electricity through her body, and she gasped as something snapped into place, a bond forming between them so suddenly and completely that it stole her breath. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see where this impossible connection leads. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The mate bond. Alara stared at him in horror and disbelief as the reality crashed over her. This man, this impossibly powerful alpha who claimed to be from 3 centuries ago, was her destined mate. She could feel him now, feel his emotions bleeding through the new connection, confusion and rage and grief, and underneath it all, bone-deep loneliness that made her chest ache. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't possible. Mate bonds don't just snap into place like that. They develop over time, this is." But he was smiling now, and it transformed his face from harsh to devastating. "They develop over time in modern wolves," he said, his hand still cupping her face like she was something precious. "But I am not modern, little Omega. I am Kale, son of Marius, 47th Alpha King of the United Packs, and the bond knows what you clearly do not. You are mine, and I am yours, and your act of freeing me has tied us together in ways that cannot be undone." Alara jerked away from his touch, her mind reeling. Alpha King. He actually claimed to be an Alpha King, and the terrible thing was, she believed him. Everything about him screamed royalty, power, divine right, things that shouldn't exist but clearly did. "If you're really an Alpha King," she said, trying to regain some control of the situation, "then prove it. The legends say you could command nature itself, that forests bowed to you, that you could call storms and calm earthquakes. Can you do that?" Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. And for the first time he looked less than absolutely confident. "I have been asleep for 3 centuries, he said slowly. "Imprisoned by magic, I do not understand. Separated from the land that sustained my power. I do not know what remains of what I once was." He turned away from her, looking around the chamber with an expression of such profound loss that Alara felt it through the bond. "But I will relearn. I will reclaim what is mine, and I will discover who betrayed me, who sealed me away and erased my line from history." He looked back at her, and the determination in his face was absolute. "You freed me, Omega. Whether you accept it or not, you are bound to me now, and I will not let you go. Together, we will restore what was lost, or we will die trying." Alara wanted to argue, wanted to run, wanted to deny everything that was happening, but the bond hummed between them, undeniable, and growing stronger with each passing moment. She was a historian, a scientist in her own way, and she dealt in facts and evidence. The fact was that an impossibly preserved man had just woken from a 300-year sleep, claimed to be an Alpha King, and formed an instant mate bond with her. The evidence suggested that everything she'd believed about their history was wrong, and that she'd just changed the course of her species' future by touching one warm pendant. "Fine," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "I'll help you. But not because of the bond. Because I need to know the truth about what happened. About why the kingdom fell and you were erased. But don't expect me to just fall at your feet because destiny says we're mates. I don't believe in that kind of inevitability." Kale's smile returned, sharper this time, predatory. "I would expect nothing less from the woman brave enough to enter a forbidden temple alone," he said. "Your fire pleases me, little Omega. It will serve us well in the days to come." The climb out of the temple was surreal. Kyle moved through the ancient passages like he owned them, which Alara supposed he had once upon a time. He stopped occasionally to examine murals or inscriptions, his expression darkening with each one. "They changed it," he murmured at one point, his fingers tracing a carved scene that showed wolves bowing before a throne. "This showed my father's coronation, but they've altered the faces, removed the symbols of our house. Someone wanted to erase us completely." Alara documented everything with her camera, her historian's mind cataloging the evidence even as her Omega instincts hummed with awareness of the powerful Alpha beside her. The bond was a constant. Presence now, a golden thread connecting them that carried emotions and sensations she wasn't ready to process. She could feel his anger at the desecration of his history, his determination to uncover the truth, and underneath everything, his fierce protectiveness toward her that both warmed and irritated her. When they finally emerged into daylight, Kale froze. The sun was setting, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, and for a long moment he simply stood there, breathing. In air that was 300 years newer than the last breath he'd taken as a free man. "It smells different," he said quietly. "The forest, the stone, everything. There's a wrongness to it, like the land itself is sick." Alara frowned, sniffing the air herself but detecting nothing unusual. "I don't smell anything wrong," she said, but Kale shook his head. "You wouldn't. The connection between Alpha Kings and the land is unique, a covenant made when the first of my line took the throne. The land sustained us, gave us power beyond normal alphas, and in return we protected it, kept it healthy and balanced. But I can feel it now. The covenant is broken, strained. The land remembers me, but it's weak, dying slowly." He closed his eyes, and Alara watched in fascination as he seemed to sink into himself, reaching for something she couldn't perceive. The air around them grew heavy, charged, and then the trees began to move, not swaying in wind. There was no wind, but turning toward them, branches bending as though drawn by invisible strings. The grass beneath their feet grew taller, greener, flowers blooming in fast forward. Kyle's eyes snapped open, glowing pure gold, and he thrust his hands forward. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every tree within sight bowed, their trunks bending in impossible angles, their leaves rustling in unified reverence. Birds erupted from branches in startled clouds, but instead of fleeing, they circled above Kale's head, singing in harmonious chorus. Even the stones seemed to hum, resonating with a frequency that Alara felt in her bones. Drop a comment below if you're as amazed by this display of power as I am. What do you think happens when the modern Pax find out their lost king has returned? Then it was over. The trees straightened, the birds dispersed, the flowers remained but stopped their rapid growth. Kale staggered slightly, and without thinking, Alara reached out to steady him. The moment she touched him, power flowed through the bond, her energy feeding into him, stabilizing him. He looked at her with surprise and something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. "The bond allows you to anchor me," he said softly, "to ground the power so it doesn't consume me. That's the purpose of true mates for Alpha Kings, why we're always paired with Omegas. You're not just my mate, Alara. You're my balance, my anchor to sanity and control." Alara pulled her hand back, disturbed by how right it had felt to support him, to be needed in that way. "I have a camp about a mile from here," she said, changing the subject. We should get there before full dark. You need food and rest, and I need time to think about what the hell happens next." Kale nodded, still watching her with that unnerving intensity, but he followed when she started walking. Her camp was basic, just a tent and supplies for a week of solitary research. But Kale examined everything with the curiosity of someone encountering an alien world. Technology had advanced significantly in 300 years, and watching him try to understand her battery-powered lantern would have been amusing if the situation weren't so insane. Alara heated rations over a portable stove while Kyle sat on a fallen log, his presence enormous even in stillness. "Tell me about the world I've woken to," he said finally. "Tell me what happened to my people, why we hide from humans, why there are no more Alpha Kings." So Alara told him, drawing on her, years of research, and the fragmented history that survived. She told him about the Great Fracturing, how 250 years ago, the unified packs had splintered into hundreds of smaller groups, each led by their own alpha, fighting over territory and resources. She told him about the rise of human civilization and technology, how wolves had been forced to hide their nature or face extinction. She told him about the modern hierarchy, how alphas ruled through intimidation and violence, how omegas were treated as lesser, how the old ways of honor and protection had degraded into might makes right. With each revelation, Kale's expression grew darker, his power pressing against the air until Alara had to ask him to control it before she suffocated. "They destroyed everything," he said, his voice rough with barely contained rage. "Everything my ancestors built, all the laws and protections, the balance we maintained. They turned us into animals, into exactly what humans fear us to." He looked at her, and she saw centuries of grief in those gold eyes. "And omegas suffer most, don't they? Without the king's protection, without the old laws that made harming an omega a capital offense, you've become targets, property." Alara nodded, surprised by the tightness in her throat. "Most omegas are claimed young by powerful alphas and never given a choice. The few of us who escape into human society are considered traitors to our kind. I've been on the run for 5 years, since I refused an alpha's claim and fled my birth pack. That's why I came here, to the most remote ruins I could find. I thought I'd be safe, that I could pursue my research in peace." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I woke up a king and tied myself to the most dangerous alpha imaginable." Kale moved suddenly, crossing the space between them in 2 strides, and before Alara could react, he was kneeling before her, taking her hands in his much larger ones. The gesture was so unexpected, so counter to everything she knew about alpha behavior, that she froze. "I am dangerous," he said, his voice low and intense. "I am violent and vengeful, and I will destroy anyone who threatens what is mine. But you, my mate, my omega, you will never fear me. You will never be property to me. In the old ways, omegas were sacred, treasured, protected above all others because you are the heart of our people, the nurturers and healers and wisdom keepers. I will restore that truth, Alara. I swear it on my crown and my blood. I will make a world where you are safe, where no omega ever has to run again." Tears burned in Alara's eyes, and she hated them, hated the hope his words sparked in her chest. Hope that something could actually change. "Pretty words," she whispered. "But you're one alpha against thousands. How can you possibly?" But Kyle smiled, and it was the smile of a king, confident and absolute. "Because the land remembers me," he said. "And soon, so will everyone else." The next morning, they began the journey down from the mountains. Kale insisted on carrying her pack despite her protests, moving through the forest with the ease of someone who belonged there, who was part of it. Alara noticed how animals watched them pass without fear, how plants seemed to lean toward Kale as he walked by, how even the sunlight seemed to favor him, breaking through the canopy to illuminate his path. The bond between them had settled into something almost comfortable, a constant awareness of each other that felt less intrusive and more like extension of her own senses. She could feel his determination, his barely leashed rage at what had become of his world, and his fierce protectiveness toward her that flared whenever they heard sounds in the forest that might indicate other wolves. They were half a day from the nearest town when they encountered the patrol. 6 wolves, all alphas by their scent, wearing the insignia of the Ridge Pack on their leather jackets. They materialized from the trees like predators, surrounding Alara and Kale with practiced efficiency. The leader, a scarred brute with cold eyes, focused immediately on Alara, his nostrils flaring. "Omega," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Unclaimed by your scent. This is Ridge Pack territory, Omega. You're trespassing, which means you're ours now by law of territory rights. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when these alphas realize they've just threatened any Alpha King's mate. It's about to get intense." Alara's heart hammered, old fear rising, but before she could speak, Kale stepped in front of her, his movement casual but completely blocking her from view. "She's not unclaimed," he said, his voice mild, almost friendly. "She's mine. And you're making a mistake." The scarred alpha laughed, and his packmates joined in, confident in their numbers. "Yours? You're not even wearing pack colors, stranger. And even if you were, she's on our land, which means..." He didn't finish the sentence. Kale's power exploded outward like a shockwave, slamming into the 6 alphas with enough force to drive them to their knees. Alara gasped, staggering from the intensity of it, but the bond protected her, channeling the excess energy away from her even as it crushed the others. Kale walked forward slowly, and with each step, the alphas bent lower, their wolves forcing them into submission, whether they wanted to or not. "Let me educate you about mistakes," Kyle said, his voice still mild, but now carrying an edge that promised violence. "Your first mistake was threatening what is mine. Your second was thinking your petty territorial claims mean anything to me. Your third was forgetting who you are, who your ancestors served, what laws once governed our kind." He stopped in front of the scarred alpha, who was shaking now, fighting his own wolf's instinct to submit completely, to roll over and expose his throat. "I am Kale, son of Marius, 40, 7th Alpha King of the United Packs," Kyle said, and power rolled through his words, making them resonate like thunder. 3 centuries ago, I was betrayed and sealed away, and in my absence, you and your kind destroyed everything we built. You turned Omegas into property, abandoned the sacred laws, fractured our people into warring tribes. But I have returned, and I will restore what was lost, starting with a lesson about respecting your betters. He leaned down, his hand gripping the scarred alpha's jaw, forcing him to meet those gold eyes. "This Omega is under my protection, as are all Omegas from this moment forward. Spread the word to your pack and every pack you encounter. The old laws are returning. Any alpha who claims an Omega without consent, who harms or threatens one, will answer to me. And trust me when I say, you do not want to face my judgment." He released the alpha with a small shove, stepping back. "Now run along and tell your alpha that the king has returned. And pray, I am in a merciful mood when I come to visit your territory." The 6 alphas fled, their pride in tatters, their wolves still whimpering from the display of absolute dominance. Alara watched them go, her mind reeling. She'd seen alphas fight, seen displays of power and dominance, but nothing like this. Kyle hadn't even needed to shift, hadn't raised his voice above conversational tones, and he'd reduced 6 grown alphas to terrified children. When she looked at him, he was already turning back to her, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the genuine concern in his voice made her chest tight. "I tried to shield you from the worst of it through the bond, but I'm still learning to control the power again. It's stronger than I remember, or perhaps I've just been separated from it for too long." Alara shook her head, still processing. "You just declared yourself king to a group of modern alphas. They're going to tell their pack. Word will spread. Every alpha in the region will know about you within days." Kale smiled, and it was sharp, satisfied. "Good. Let them know. Let them come. I'm tired of hiding, of creeping through the forest like a ghost. If I'm going to reclaim my throne, I need to remind our people what an Alpha King truly is, what power they've lost by fragmenting into these pathetic territorial squabbles. They reached the town by evening, a small settlement that existed primarily to service the logging industry. Ilara had a room at the local motel, paid for in cash, under a false name. The modern world, Cale discovered, was fascinatingly complex and frustratingly restrictive. He had no identification, no money, no official existence, which meant he was dependent on Ilara for basic necessities. It grated against his pride, being provided for by his Omega rather than providing for her, but she seemed grimly amused by his discomfort. "Welcome to the modern world," she said, unlocking the motel room door, "where even kings need credit cards and social security numbers." The room was small, one bed, basic amenities, but Cale examined everything with intense focus, trying to understand 300 years of human advancement compressed into a single evening. The television particularly fascinated and disturbed him. Humanity's events and entertainment broadcast into every home, creating a connected world he barely recognized. Ilara ordered food from a local restaurant, and when it arrived, Cale stared at the eye. Burger and fries like they might attack him. "Just eat it," Ilara said, biting into her own food. "I know it's different from what you're used to, but it's safe." Cale ate slowly, processing flavors and textures that were simultaneously familiar and alien. Between bites, Ilara pulled out her laptop, another device that made Cale's head hurt, and began typing rapidly. "I'm reaching out to my contacts," she explained. "Other historians, researchers, people who might have information about the fracturing or what happened to you. If we're going to figure out who betrayed you and why, we need more than just legends and suppressed records." Kyle watched her work, admiring her focus, the quick intelligence in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional aesthetics and everything to do with the fierce spirit burning inside her. The bond hummed with his attraction, and he knew she felt it too by the way her cheeks flushed. But she stubbornly ignored it, keeping her attention on the screen. "Tell me about the betrayal," she said without looking up. "What do you remember from before you were sealed?" Cale leaned back against the headboard, his mind turning to memories he'd rather leave buried. "It was during the Winter Council," he said slowly. "All the regional alphas gathered at the capital to discuss territory disputes and Omega protection laws I wanted to implement. There was resistance. There always was when I tried to limit alpha power or expand Omega rights, but this time felt different, more organized, more dangerous." He paused, remembering faces he'd trusted, voices raised in what seemed like honest debate, but must have been distraction. "My Beta Theron suggested we visit the old temple in the mountains, the place where the covenant between the Alpha Kings and the land was first made. He said it might help me connect more deeply with the power, strengthen my authority for the reforms I wanted, to push through." I trusted him. He'd been my friend since childhood, trained alongside me, bled with me in a dozen battles, so I went. The memory sharpened, painful despite the centuries that had passed. The moment I entered the inner sanctum, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with magic that shouldn't have been there, and Theron's scent was off. Wrong. Tainted with something I didn't recognize. He'd brought others. Mages practicing the old dark arts that I'd banned when I took the throne. They chanted in languages that made my bones ache, and silver chains erupted from the floor, wrapping around me faster than I could react. Silver doesn't just burn us, it severs our connection to our power, and these chains were specially crafted to contain an Alpha King. Ilara had stopped typing, her full attention on him now, her expression pained. Through the bond, he felt her sympathy, her anger on his behalf, and it soothed some of the old hurt. "Theron told me everything as the magic took hold," Cale continued, his voice hardening. "The council didn't want reform. They liked the power they had, liked being able to treat Omegas as property, liked the territorial system that let them rule their regions like personal kingdoms. My talk of unity, of returning to the old laws that limited alpha authority and protected the vulnerable, threatened everything they'd built in my father's declining years. So they decided to remove me. But they couldn't kill an Alpha King outright, without risking the land's wrath. Instead, they sealed me, used magic to make me sleep until the land itself died, or until someone foolish enough to enter the forbidden temple broke the seal. He looked at Alara, and despite the pain of the memory, he smiled slightly. They didn't count on a stubborn Omega historian who refused to believe their revisionist history. You saved me, Alara. You gave me a second chance to finish what I started, to protect the Omegas and reform our people. For that, I will be eternally grateful. If you're invested in this story of betrayal and redemption, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think Kale should do when he finds his betrayer's descendants. Show this channel some love. Alara closed her laptop, her dark eyes serious. If your beta betrayed you, and the council supported him, then their lines are probably the ones who benefited most from the fracturing. We need to identify the current pack leaders, trace their lineages, see who descends from the wolves who sealed you away. Kale nodded slowly, his mind already working through the political implications. And when we find them, they'll have to answer for their ancestors' crimes. Blood debt doesn't expire, not for treason against the throne. Alara frowned, and he felt her discomfort through the bond. Kyle, these wolves weren't alive when you were betrayed. Is it really justice to punish them for something their great-great-grandparents did? Kale's expression hardened. If they've benefited from that betrayal, if they've used power and territory stolen from my line, then yes, justice demands accountability. And I will have it. They stared at each other, the first real conflict between them rising like a wall, and Kale realized with surprise that he cared what she thought, that her approval mattered to him in ways that went beyond the bond. She was his mate, yes, but she was also becoming his conscience, the voice of reason that he'd lost when Theron betrayed him. The night deepened, and the single bed became an unavoidable reality. Alara showered first, emerging in sleep clothes that covered her completely, but somehow made her more attractive to Kale's hungry eyes. He took his turn, letting hot water sluice away 300 years of imprisonment, washing his hair with products that smelled nothing like the oils and soaps he remembered. When he emerged, Alara was already in bed, pressed against the far edge like she could will herself. Through the wall, Kale slid in beside her, hyper-aware of every inch of space between them, the bond singing with proximity and unsatisfied desire. I won't touch you without permission, he said into the darkness. The bond is powerful, but consent matters more. You don't have to fear me, Alara. He heard her breath hitch, felt her surprise through the connection. You're not what I expected, she said softly. Every alpha I've known has taken what they wanted, justified it with instinct or hierarchy or destiny. But you ask, you wait, you care what I think even when you disagree. Why? Kyle turned on his side, looking at her silhouette in the dim light from the window. Because you're not property, you're my partner. Alpha Kings didn't rule alone. We ruled with our Omega mates, who tempered our violence with wisdom, our ambition with compassion. Without you, I'm just another alpha with too much power and not enough restraint. With you, I can be the king my people need. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. And then Alara turned toward him, her eyes luminous in the dark. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared of the bond. Scared of what you represent. Scared that I'll lose myself in this connection and forget who I was before you. But I'm also drawn to you in ways I don't understand, and I hate it and crave it in equal measure. Kale reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, he cupped her face with a gentleness that contradicted his warrior's hands. You won't lose yourself, he promised. I'll make sure of it. Your strength, your intelligence, your stubbornness, they're what make you perfect for me. I don't want a submissive Omega who exists only to please me. I want you, exactly as you are, challenging me and questioning me and forcing me to be better than my worst impulses. Alara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, and Kale felt her surrender to the moment even as she maintained her emotional boundaries. It was enough, more than enough, and when she finally drifted to sleep, still close, but not quite touching, Kale lay awake, planning the restoration of his kingdom and the protection of the woman who had become his entire world in the span of 2 days. The next week was a whirlwind of revelation and recruitment. Alara's contacts began responding, sending fragmented records and oral histories that painted a clearer picture of the fracturing. It had been orchestrated, carefully, planned, using the absence of the Alpha King to justify the dissolution of unified pack structure. Theron had declared himself regent, claimed the throne was vacant due to Kale's mysterious disappearance, and within a generation, the old ways were forgotten, replaced by territorial alphas who answered to no higher authority. The descendants of the Traitor Council now led the most powerful packs in the region, and they would see Kale's return as an existential threat. Meanwhile, Kale worked on reconnecting with the land, spending hours in the forest surrounding the town, relearning the covenant that had once been as natural as breathing. Alara accompanied him, documenting everything, her scientific mind trying to quantify magic that defied quantification. She watched as he coaxed trees to grow, as he called deer that approached without fear, as he sank his hands into the earth and made it pulse with vitality. The land responded to him, slowly at first, hesitant like a lover betrayed, but with increasing enthusiasm as it recognized its king. "It's beautiful," Alara said one afternoon, watching flowers bloom in his footsteps, "but it's also terrifying. This kind of power, Kale, it could so easily be abused." Kale nodded, not offended by her concern. "That's why Alpha Kings were always paired with Omega mates," he explained. "The power is tied to the land, which means it's tied to life itself, to growth and nurturing. But it can be twisted, used to dominate and destroy rather, than protect and cultivate. Omegas, with your instincts toward preservation and harmony, anchor us. Keep us from becoming tyrants drunk on power we can't control." He looked at her seriously. "I need you, Alara, not just as my mate, but as my balance. If I start to go too far, to use this power for revenge rather than justice, you have to stop me. Promise me." Alara met his eyes, seeing the genuine fear there, the awareness of what he could become without restraint. "I promise," she said. "You have to promise to listen when I call you out, to value my perspective even when it contradicts what you want." Kyle smiled, pulling her close, ignoring her token protest. "Always," he said against her hair, "you're the wisest person I've met in either century, little Omega. I'd be a fool not to listen." Their peaceful week ended when the first challengers arrived. 5 Alpha Pack leaders, representing the largest territories in the region, demanded a meeting. They gathered at the local bar, neutral territory by unspoken agreement, and Kyle attended with Alara at his side. The moment they entered, power filled the room like smoke, competing authorities clashing in invisible combat. The 5 alphas were all large, dangerous men, each radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged, and they looked at Kale with varying degrees of suspicion and contempt. The Ridge Pack Alpha, a massive brute named Marcus who bore a striking resemblance to the scarred patrol leader they'd encountered, spoke first. "So you're the one claiming to be the lost Alpha King," he said, his tone mocking. "You've got power, I'll grant you that. But power alone doesn't make you royalty. We've built a good system here, stranger. Territories are clear, disputes are resolved through strength, and every alpha rules his own pack without interference. We don't need a king, and we certainly don't need some ancient ghost trying to drag us back to outdated laws and hierarchies. Don't go anywhere, because Kyle's response to this challenge is going to shake the foundations of modern wolf society. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch every moment." Kyle leaned back in his chair, the picture of casual confidence. But Alara felt the predator beneath the surface, coiled and ready to strike. "Outdated laws," he repeated softly. "You mean the laws that protected Omegas from forced claiming? That required alphas to prove themselves worthy of leadership, rather than just taking it. Through violence? That maintained unity, and prevented the kind of territorial wars that have killed thousands of our people over the last 3 centuries?" He leaned forward suddenly, his gold eyes blazing. "Your good system, Marcus, is built on the suffering of the vulnerable and the fractured remnants of a once great civilization. You call yourselves pack leaders, but you're just warlords squabbling over scraps. Pretending that might makes right is the same as legitimate authority." Another, Alpha, silver-haired and calculating, spoke up. "Even if you are who you claim, even if you were sealed away 300 years ago, what right do you have to return and demand we bow to you? The world moved on without you. We've built our own power structures, our own rules. You're an anachronism, King, and anachronisms don't survive." Kale smiled, and it was terrifying. "Let me show you something about survival," he said. He stood, and the other alphas tensed, hands moving to weapons they'd brought despite the neutral territory rules. But Kale didn't attack. Instead, he walked to the bar's back door and opened it. Stepping into the small parking lot behind the building, the 5 alphas followed, unwilling to show fear, and Alara trailed behind, her heart hammering with anticipation and dread. Kale stood in the center of the lot, surrounded by asphalt and concrete, as far from nature as you could get in this small town. He closed his eyes, and Alara felt power building through the bond, massive and controlled, a storm contained in flesh. Then he released it. The asphalt cracked, and from every fissure, plants erupted. Grass, flowers, saplings, vines, they burst through human construction like it was paper, transforming the parking lot into a wild garden in seconds. The trees surrounding the lot bent inward, their branches forming a living cathedral, and every animal within a mile radius came running or flying or crawling. Birds covered the roof in such numbers it looked like a living carpet. Deer and rabbits and foxes emerged from the forest, surrounding Kale in a perfect circle, their eyes reflecting the gold glow of his power. Even insects swarmed, creating patterns in the air that spelled out ancient symbols of kingship that only wolves could read. And through it all, Kale stood untouched, perfectly calm, the axis around which nature itself revolved. "This is the power of an alpha king," he said, his voice carrying despite not being raised. "This is the covenant between my line and the land itself, forged 5,000 years ago when the first of my ancestors proved themselves worthy. You call it outdated, but it's the foundation of everything we are, the reason we exist as more than animals. And I am its living embodiment, returned from imprisonment, to remind you what you've lost." He opened his eyes, and the display ended as suddenly as it began. Plants stopped growing, animals dispersed, branches straightened. In seconds, the only evidence of what had happened was the garden now covering the parking lot, and the profound silence from 5 alphas who'd just had their worldview shattered. Marcus recovered first, his face red with anger and something that looked like fear. "Parlor tricks," he spat, but his voice shook. "Power isn't everything. You still have no pack, no territory, no infrastructure to support a kingdom. You're one wolf with flashy abilities, nothing more." Kale tilted his head, considering. "You're right that I need to rebuild. But tell me, Marcus, do you know why your ancestors swore loyalty to my line? Why the Ridge Pack, for 3 generations before the fracturing, served as the southern guardians of the capital?" Marcus froze, shock replacing anger. "How do you know that?" he demanded. "That history was lost, suppressed." Kale smiled coldly. "It was suppressed, yes, but I lived it. Your great-great-grandfather, Silas Ridge, was one of the finest warriors I ever commanded. He died defending my father, against a rogue pack from the north, gave his life without hesitation because he understood what the kingdom meant. What unity gave us that territorial isolation never could. And you dishonor his memory with every omega you allow to be claimed against her will. With every territorial dispute you escalate into violence." He turned to the other alphas, naming their ancestors, recounting deeds and oaths that had been forgotten, painting a picture of what their packs had once been when they served, something greater than their own power. Alara watched the alphas' faces change, watched skepticism give way to confusion, and then to a dawning recognition that this wasn't a con, that somehow, impossibly, the man before them really was who he claimed to be. The silver-haired alpha, whose name was Gregory, spoke finally, his voice careful. Even if you are Kale, even if you truly are the 47th Alpha King, you were sealed away for treason, weren't you? The stories say you tried to abolish the Alpha hierarchy, to give Omegas equal authority, that you threatened the natural order. Kyle's laugh was bitter. The natural order, he repeated. Is that what they told you? That my reforms were unnatural, that protecting the vulnerable was against our instincts? He shook his head. I was sealed because I threatened the power of corrupt alphas who wanted to rule like tyrants instead of leaders. Yes, I wanted to give Omegas more rights, to make it illegal to claim them without consent, to punish alphas who abused their position. And yes, some saw that as threatening the hierarchy, but the true hierarchy, the one that kept our people strong for millennia, was never about domination. It was about responsibility. Alphas led because we were willing to die for our packs, to put their needs above our own. Omegas were treasured because you're the heart of our society, the ones who maintained our culture and raised our young and healed our wounded. The hierarchy was reciprocal, built on mutual respect and clearly defined duties. He gestured to the garden he'd created. This is what I offer: a return to purpose, to meaning beyond territorial squabbles and dominance games. I offer the protection of the land itself, the power to stand against human encroachment, unity that makes us stronger than the sum of our parts. But I also demand accountability. If you swear to me, you swear to uphold laws that protect all wolves, not just the strong. You give up the right to treat Omegas as property, to rule through fear alone. You become leaders worthy of the title. The 5 alphas looked at each other, silent communication passing between them. Finally, Marcus spoke again, and this time the mockery was gone from his voice. You ask us to give up power we've spent lifetimes building, to submit to authority we've never known, to change systems that work for us even if they don't work for everyone. That's not a small thing, King. Kale nodded. No, it's not. It's a huge thing. Perhaps the hardest thing you'll ever do. But consider the alternative. Continue as you are, fractured and weak, losing territory to human expansion every year, watching your Omegas flee to human society rather than stay in packs that mistreat them, fighting endless wars over boundaries that mean nothing. Or join me. Help me rebuild the kingdom and become part of something lasting, something worthy of the ancestors whose names you carry. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. Go back to your packs, discuss it with your betas and elders. But know this: I will restore the kingdom with or without you. The land has already chosen me, acknowledged my claim. Other packs will follow, drawn by the promise of purpose and protection. You can be part of the restoration, or you can be obstacles to be removed. Choose wisely. The meeting ended without resolution, but Alara could see the seeds of doubt and possibility taking root in the Alpha's expressions. As they dispersed, she heard them talking in low voices, no longer dismissive, but genuinely considering. Kyle watched them go, his expression unreadable. Did I do the right thing? He asked quietly, and Alara was struck by the vulnerability in the question, the way he genuinely wanted her input. I think so, she said slowly. You gave them a vision of something better, but you also acknowledged that it would cost them. That's more honest than most leaders would be. She hesitated, then added, but Kale, you have to actually deliver on those promises. If wolves join you expecting protection and purpose, and you just become another tyrant using pretty words to justify absolute power, you'll be worse than what we have now. Kale pulled her close, and she went willingly now, the bond and her growing feelings for him overriding her instinct to maintain distance. That's why I need you, he murmured against her hair, to keep me honest, to call me out when I fall short. Will you do that? Alara, will you be my conscience as well as my mate? Alara pulled back enough to look into his eyes, seeing the genuine need there, the awareness that absolute power required absolute accountability. Yes, she said, but only if you promise to actually listen, even when you don't like what I'm saying. Kyle smiled, and it transformed his harsh features into something beautiful. "I promise," he said, and sealed it with a kiss that made the bond flare bright with joy and satisfaction. The kiss deepened. 300 years of loneliness and 5 years of running from destiny colliding in mutual hunger and tenderness. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Alara knew that the walls between them were crumbling, that whether she wanted it or not, she was falling for the impossible alpha who'd declared himself king and chosen her as his queen. Over the following weeks, packs began to arrive. Not the 5 who'd challenged Kale. They were still deliberating, still weighing the cost of submission against the promise of purpose. But smaller packs, rogues and outcasts, omegas fleeing abusive situations, young alphas hungry for something more meaningful than territorial disputes. They came seeking the Alpha King, drawn by rumors that spread like wildfire through wolf society, and Kale welcomed them all. Please hit that like button if you're as moved by this story as I am, and drop a comment about what kind of kingdom you think Kale and Alara are building. Your engagement means everything. Alara watched him work, organizing the refugees into the skeleton of a pack structure, assigning duties based on skills rather than rank, listening to grievances and dispensing justice with a fairness that shocked wolves accustomed to arbitrary alpha authority. He was a natural leader, charismatic and commanding, but he also showed surprising gentleness with traumatized omegas and patience with skeptical newcomers. And through it all, he included Alara in every major decision, asked her opinion on laws and policies, introduced her as his mate and co-leader in ways that made her equal rather than decoration. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. This vision of what their people could become if they chose unity over isolation. The first major test came when an omega named Sarah arrived, fleeing from the Ridge Pack with bruises covering her arms and terror in her eyes. She'd been claimed by Marcus's younger brother against her will. And when she'd tried to refuse, she'd been beaten and imprisoned. She'd escaped during a supply run, running for days through the forest, following rumors that the Alpha King protected omegas who sought sanctuary. Kyle listened to her story with an expression of barely contained rage, and when she finished, he stood abruptly, power crackling around him like lightning. "Marcus made his choice," he said, his voice cold. "He had weeks to consider my offer, to start implementing reforms in his pack. Instead, he allowed this. No more patience, no more waiting for them to come around willingly." He looked at Alara, and she saw the violence in his eyes, the predator ready to hunt. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. "Tell me I should try diplomacy again. Give them more time. Because right now, all I want is to rip Marcus and his brother apart for allowing this to happen under their authority." Ilara's first instinct was to counsel caution, to suggest more negotiation, but then she looked at Sarah, saw the hopelessness and pain in her eyes, and something hardened in her chest. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "Sarah isn't the first Omega to flee the Ridge Pack, and she won't be the last unless something changes. Maybe it's time to stop asking nicely and start enforcing the laws you've laid out." Kale nodded slowly, and she felt his grim satisfaction through the bond. "Then we go to war," he said. "Not to conquer, but to liberate. And when we're done, Marcus will understand that claiming the title of Alpha means accepting responsibility for every wolf under his authority." The assault on Ridgepack territory was swift and decisive. Cal brought 20 wolves, a mixture of alphas and betas who'd sworn to him, not enough to overwhelm Marcus's 50-strong pack. But Kale didn't need numbers. He had the land itself fighting for him. They approached at dawn, and Kale didn't bother with stealth. He walked straight through the forest toward the pack compound, and as he walked, trees moved aside, creating a perfect path. Animals followed in his wake, hundreds of them, creating an army of claws and teeth and wild power that made Marcus's guards freeze in shock. The pack alpha emerged from the main lodge, his expression furious, flanked by his brother and their strongest fighters. "You dare attack my territory!" Marcus roared. I told you we needed time to consider, that we weren't ready to submit to your authority. Kale stopped 50 feet away, and the animals with him formed a semicircle, blocking any escape. You had time, Kale said, his voice carrying. You had weeks to start protecting your omegas, to implement even basic reforms. Instead, I have Sarah in my camp, beaten and traumatized because your brother claimed her against her will and you allowed it. So no, Marcus, I'm not here to attack your territory. I'm here to execute justice for crimes committed under your watch. The fight was brutal but short. Marcus's wolves were skilled, hardened by years of territorial battles. But they'd never faced anything like Kale. He moved through them like a force of nature, his power crushing resistance before they could mount a coordinated defense. And when Marcus himself shifted, a massive dark wolf with murder in his eyes, Kale met him with a transformation that made Alara's breath catch. His wolf was enormous, easily twice the size of Marcus's, with fur the color of midnight, and those same gold eyes burning with righteous fury. The battle between them lasted less than 5 minutes before Kale had Marcus pinned, jaws around his throat, one bite away from ending him. But he didn't bite down. Instead, he shifted back to human form, leaving Marcus in wolf form beneath him, vulnerable and defeated. I could kill you, Kale said, addressing not just Marcus but every Ridgepack wolf watching. By the old laws, your crimes merit death. But I'm not here to destroy. I'm here to rebuild. So I offer you a choice, Marcus. Submit to me, acknowledge my authority, and accept judgment for allowing Sarah's abuse. Or refuse, and I'll dismantle your pack, free your omegas, and scatter your wolves to the winds. Choose. Marcus shifted back, his face pressed into the dirt, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, he bared his throat in the ultimate gesture of submission. I submit, he said, the words clearly painful. I acknowledge you as Alpha King, and I accept judgment for my failures. Kyle stood, allowing Marcus to rise, and Alara stepped forward from where she'd been watching with their wolves. This was her role, the balance to Kale's violence, and she played it now. Marcus, she said, her voice firm despite her racing heart. Your brother will be exiled from the pack for 3 years to contemplate his crime. You will implement immediate reforms. No Omega can be claimed without freely given consent. Any Alpha who harms an Omega will be expelled, and you'll establish an Omega Council with real authority to bring grievances directly to you. These reforms will be supervised by representatives from the King's Court, and if you violate them, exile will be the least of your consequences. Do you accept these terms? Marcus looked at her, and she saw resentment and respect warring in his expression. I accept, he said finally. But know this, King-Queen. Change doesn't happen overnight. My wolves are used to the old ways, and some will resist. Kyle nodded. Then it's your job to make them understand that resistance means leaving your pack. I won't tolerate half measures, Marcus. You're either part of the solution, or you're part of the problem I'm here to solve. The Ridgepack's submission sent shockwaves through wolf society. Within days, 3 of the other 5 alphas who challenged Kale sent envoys requesting formal meetings to discuss terms of allegiance. The 4th, Gregory, arrived personally with his entire pack council, ready to swear loyalty on the condition that his Omega sister be given a position of authority in the new kingdom structure. Kale agreed immediately, recognizing the value of having Omegas in leadership, and Alara found herself with the beginnings of an Omega Council. Wolves from various packs who'd either fled abuse or sought purpose beyond traditional Omega roles. Only one of the original 5, an alpha named Victor, who led the Canyon Pack in the Eastern Territories, remained defiant. He sent a message instead of an envoy, and its contents made Kale's expression darken with rage. He knows, Kale said, handing Alara the letter. Victor knows about Theron, about the betrayal. He says he has records from the fracturing, documents that prove the Council's actions were legal and justified. Alara read the letter, her stomach sinking. Victor wasn't just challenging Kale's authority, he was claiming that Kale's reforms had been illegal, that the sealing had been legitimate because Kale had overstepped his authority as king. It was a clever argument, one that could sway wolves who were uncertain about submitting to royal authority again. "We need to see those documents," Ilara said. "If Victor has proof of what happened during the fracturing, it could either vindicate you or reveal truths you're not ready to face." Kale's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we go to the canyon pack," he said. "But this time, we go carefully. Victor has had 3 centuries to prepare for my return, assuming he knew the seal could be broken. He's dangerous, Ilara. More dangerous than Marcus ever was." The journey to Canyon Pack territory took 3 days, and Kale insisted on bringing a full escort of 30 wolves, leaving the camp in the care of Gregory and his council. Ilara rode in a truck at the center of the convoy, watching Kale through the window as he ran in wolf form with his guards, a massive shadow moving through the forest. The bond hummed constantly now, so integrated into her awareness that she rarely noticed it, except when emotions ran high. She could feel his anticipation and dread in equal measure, his certainty that Victor represented a greater threat than simple territorial resistance. The Canyon Pack compound was built into the side of a cliff, using natural caves expanded into a complex warren of tunnels and chambers. It was defensible, isolated, and according to intelligence Ilara had gathered, home to the largest collection of pre-fracturing records and artifacts in existence. Victor had apparently spent generations collecting suppressed history, building a case that the modern system was better than the old kingdom had ever been. Subscribe now so you don't miss the confrontation that will determine the future of wolf society. This is where everything changes. They were met at the compound entrance by Victor himself, a lean alpha with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge. "Welcome, Alpha King," he said, his tone mocking the title. "I'm honored that you accepted my invitation. Please, follow me. I have so much to show you." The compound's interior was surprisingly sophisticated, lit by electric lights and organized like a museum. Victor led them through corridors lined with display cases holding artifacts from the Old Kingdom. Weapons, jewelry, documents sealed in protective cases. Kale stopped at each one, his expression growing more pained as he recognized objects from his time, pieces of a world that had been systematically destroyed. Finally, they reached a large chamber set up like a lecture hall, and Victor gestured to the seats arranged before a projection screen. "Please sit. Let me educate you about the kingdom you're trying to restore." What followed was 3 hours of carefully curated history that painted the Old Kingdom in the worst possible light. Victor presented documents, testimonies, and records that showed Alpha Kings as tyrants who crushed dissent, who claimed Omegas for their own pleasure regardless of consent, who used their power to dominate rather than protect. He showed economic data suggesting the kingdom had been on the verge of collapse, that territorial fragmentation had actually improved quality of life for average wolves. He presented everything with scholarly precision, and Ilara, with her historian's training, could see how compelling the narrative was, how easily someone could look at this evidence and conclude that Kale's sealing had been necessary, even heroic. But she could also see the gaps, the careful editing, the way certain contradictory evidence was omitted or explained away, and through the bond, she felt Kale's growing rage, not at being challenged, but at seeing his ancestors' legacy twisted into propaganda, justifying their destruction. When Victor finally finished, he looked at Kale with something like pity. "You were a product of your time," he said, "raised to believe in divine right and absolute authority. But the world moved past that need. We don't need kings anymore. Kale, we're better off governing ourselves, making our own choices without bowing to someone who claims power from ancient covenants and bloodline magic." Kale stood slowly, and power radiated from him in waves that made the lights flicker. "You're very good," he said softly. "Very convincing, with your carefully selected evidence and your reasonable tone. But you made one critical mistake, Victor." He smiled, and it was terrible. "You assumed I didn't know my own history, that 300 years would let you rewrite it without challenge. But I lived it. I remember every decision, every law, every reform I fought for. And I know what you've left out." He gestured, and the lights went out, plunging the chamber into darkness. but not total darkness, because Kale was glowing now, that gold light emanating from his eyes and spreading across his skin like fire. When he spoke, his voice echoed with power that made the stone walls tremble. You showed records of Alpha Kings claiming Omegas by force, but you didn't mention that those kings were removed by their councils, that we had systems for deposing tyrants long before humans developed democracy. You presented economic data from the kingdom's final years, but you didn't explain that the decline happened because my father was poisoned slowly by the same council that eventually sealed me, that they deliberately sabotaged the kingdom to justify its dissolution. You talked about the benefits of territorial fragmentation, but you didn't count the thousands of Omegas who've suffered without royal protection. The territorial wars that have killed more wolves in 3 centuries than died in 1,000 years of kingdom rule. The lights came back on, but Kyle was still glowing, and every wolf in the room was pressed back in their seats, overwhelmed by the authority radiating from him. You have records, Victor, but I have truth. And truth doesn't need careful curation or selective presentation. So let me show you what you've really been defending. Kale raised his hands, and the chamber transformed. Images appeared in the air, not projections, but something else. Memories given form through power Alara didn't understand. She watched scenes from the old kingdom play out around them. Councils where Omegas spoke with authority equal to Alphas. Festivals celebrating successful harvests and the birth of pups. Alpha Kings mediating disputes with wisdom rather than violence. Omegas teaching pups the old languages and histories. The intricate web of mutual obligation and respect that had held their society together for millennia. But Kale also showed the darkness, the slow corruption, as certain alphas pushed for more power. The council's growing resentment of reforms that limited their authority, Theron's careful manipulation and final betrayal. He showed his own mistakes, times when he'd been too harsh or moved too quickly, pushing changes his people weren't ready for. He didn't hide his flaws, didn't pretend to be perfect, and that honesty made the truth of his vision even more compelling. When the images faded, silence filled the chamber. Victor sat frozen, his expression shattered, and Alara realized he'd never actually known the full truth, that he'd been fed the same propaganda he'd been spreading, honestly believing he was preventing the return of tyranny. I'm not here to restore blind obedience or absolute monarchy, Kyle said, his voice gentle now, almost kind. I'm here to restore balance, to rebuild systems that protected all wolves rather than just the powerful. Yes, the old kingdom had flaws, serious ones, and I won't recreate them. But what we have now is worse, Victor. Fragmentation has made us weak, vulnerable, and it's allowed abuse to flourish without consequence. I offer something better. Unity with accountability, strength with justice, hierarchy based on responsibility rather than domination. He extended his hand to Victor, a gesture of partnership rather than conquest. Help me build it right this time. Use your knowledge and resources to create checks on royal authority, systems that prevent the kind of corruption that destroyed the old kingdom. Be the voice of skepticism and caution that keeps me from repeating my ancestors' mistakes. But do it from inside the kingdom, as part of the solution, not as an enemy defending a broken system. Victor stared at the offered hand for a long moment, and Alara held her breath, knowing this moment could determine everything. If Victor joined them, his credibility and resources could legitimize Kale's restoration in ways that force never could. If he refused, they'd face years of resistance from wolves who saw Kale as a threat to hard-won independence. Finally, slowly, Victor reached out and clasped Kale's hand. I'll help you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I'll also challenge you, question you, hold you accountable to the promises you're making today. Can you accept that? Kale pulled Victor into a formal embrace, the old gesture of alliance between alphas, and Alara saw tears on both their faces. I demand it, Kale said. A king without opposition becomes a tyrant. Be my conscience, Victor, along with Alara. Keep me honest. The next 6 months were a blur of activity. With Victor's support, packs across the region began swearing allegiance. drawn by the combination of Kale's power and his vision of reformed governance. Alara worked with the Omega Council to draft laws protecting their rights while creating new roles for Omegas in pack administration. They established schools teaching the old languages and histories, reclaimed sacred sites that had been abandoned, and most importantly, they built a capital at the site of the ancient temple where Kale had been sealed. The construction happened with supernatural speed, Kale using his connection to the land to literally grow structures from living wood, stone rising from the earth in formations that followed his will. It was beautiful and eerie, watching a city take shape through magic that hadn't been seen in 3 centuries. And wolves came from hundreds of miles to witness the restoration of wonders they'd believed were merely legends. But not everyone was pleased. There were attacks, assassination attempts, packs that refused to submit and had to be forcibly integrated or scattered. Kyle handled it all with a combination of overwhelming power and surprising mercy, offering rebels the choice between exile and integration, killing only when absolutely necessary. And through everything, Alara was at his side, his partner in truth as well as name, tempering his harsher impulses while supporting his vision of a unified, just society. The bond between them had deepened into something beyond destiny, becoming genuine love built on respect and shared purpose. They completed their mating on the night of the winter solstice, in the new temple built at the capital's heart, surrounded by their closest allies and blessed by the land itself. And when spring came, bringing with it the first council of the restored kingdom, Alara stood before an assembly of 200 alphas, betas, and omegas, carrying Kale's child and wearing the crown of the Omega Queen, and knew that they'd accomplished something impossible. They'd taken a broken, fractured society and given it hope for something better. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this journey. Please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. Leave a comment telling me what you loved about Kale and Alara's journey. Your support means the world. The council meeting was historic, the first time in 3 centuries that all regional packs had gathered in unity. Kale presided with Alara at his side, and together they presented the new governmental structure: a high council with representatives from each pack, an Omega Council with veto power over laws affecting their welfare, and a king whose authority derived not from absolute right, but from the consent of the governed, renewable every decade through formal reaffirmation. It wasn't perfect. There were arguments and compromises and concessions that left everyone slightly unsatisfied. But it was functional, sustainable, and most importantly, it protected the vulnerable while maintaining strong leadership. Marcus spoke for the former resistors, acknowledging the benefits of unity while expressing continued concerns about royal power. Gregory represented the Omega Council, presenting their drafted legislation with a confidence that would have been unthinkable in the old system. And Victor, now serving as the kingdom's historian and keeper of records, documented everything, ensuring that future generations would know how the restoration had happened, what principles it was founded on, what mistakes had been made, and how they'd been addressed. When the formal business concluded, Kale stood, and silence fell. Immediately, 300 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, I was sealed away for trying to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, for believing that strength meant lifting others up rather than dominating them, for insisting that our hierarchy served a purpose beyond personal power. My enemies called me a tyrant and a threat to natural order. They were wrong then, and those who make the same argument today are wrong now. But I understand their fear, because power without accountability is tyranny, and I ask much when I ask you to trust me with the kind of authority an Alpha King wields. He looked at Alara, and she saw love and gratitude in his expression that made her chest tight. That's why I don't rule alone. My mate, your queen, is my balance and my conscience. The Omega Council is my check against laws that benefit alphas at others' expense. The High Council ensures that regional needs are heard and addressed. And all of you, every wolf who's chosen to be part of this restored kingdom, you're my accountability. If I become what my enemies accused me of being, if I use power to dominate rather than protect, then you have not just the right, but the duty to remove me. That's the covenant I make today, witnessed by the land itself, and sealed by my blood and my crown." He drew a silver knife, ancient and ceremonial, and drew it across his palm. Blood welled, bright red, and he let it drip onto the stone floor of the hall. Where it fell, flowers bloomed, white and gold, and their scent filled the air with promises of growth and renewal. "I am Kale, son of Marius, 47th Alpha King of the United Packs, and I swear to protect and serve you all, Alpha and Omega, strong and vulnerable, for as long as you'll have me. This is my oath, given freely, bound by magic and witnessed by nature. Hold me to it." The response was deafening. Wolves from hundreds of packs rising to their feet, howling their acceptance and allegiance. And in that moment, Alara felt the land itself respond, felt the covenant Kale had spoken of solidify and strengthen, binding him not just to her, but to every wolf who'd chosen to follow, creating a web of mutual obligation and support that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The kingdom had been restored, not as it was, but as it should have been, learning from past mistakes while honoring ancient wisdom. And at its heart were two wolves who'd found each other, across centuries and impossibilities, who'd chosen partnership over domination, justice over vengeance, and hope over cynicism. The Alpha King's power hadn't died with the old kingdom after all. It had simply been waiting for the right moment, the right Omega, the right cause to wake it again. And now, as the forest bowed and the people rejoiced, it blazed brighter than ever before, promising a future worth fighting for. Epilogue. 5 years after the restoration, Alara stood in the garden of the royal residence, watching her daughter play among flowers that bloomed in response to the child's laughter. Amara was 3, with her father's gold eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, already showing signs of the power she'd inherited from both bloodlines. She was the first child born to an Alpha King and his true mate in over 3 centuries, and the land itself celebrated her existence, responding to her joy and her tantrums with equal enthusiasm. Kale emerged from the residence, reports in hand, and Alara smiled at the sight of him. 5 years hadn't diminished his power or his presence, but they'd softened him in ways she loved, teaching him patience and compromise, showing him that strength could be gentle. He joined her on the bench, dropping the reports beside him, and pulled her close. "The Southern Territories are requesting more Omega teachers," he said. "Apparently our schools are so popular that traditional packs are starting to adopt the model. Victor thinks we'll have universal literacy within a generation." Alara leaned into him, content. "That's your legacy," she said. "Not the power or the battles, but the systems you've built that will outlast both of us." Kale kissed her temple, watching their daughter discover that she could make flowers grow just by wanting them to. "Our legacy," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, little Omega. You're the heart of everything I've built, the reason it works." They sat in comfortable silence. The bond between them, a warm presence that had become as natural as breathing. The kingdom still faced challenges, still had wolves who resisted change or tested boundaries, but it was stable, growing stronger with each passing year. And at its center was a love that had defied time and fate, transforming both a king and his queen into something greater than either could have been alone. The forest bowed, as it always did in their presence. And in the distance, wolves howled in contentment. And the future stretched ahead full of promise and possibility. The Alpha King's power had returned, and with it, hope for a better world.